It was one of those quiet evenings that felt almost too perfect, the kind where the air is calm, and the only sounds you hear are the distant hum of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. A 72-year-old man, a retired teacher, who had spent most of his life giving back to his community, decided to take a short walk after dinner. He wasn't going far, just around the block like he always did. This was his routine, something he'd done for years. It gave him time to think, to reflect on life, and to enjoy the little things like the way the streetlights cast soft glows on the pavement, or how the cool night air brushed against his skin. This man was well known in the neighborhood. Everyone called him by his first name, kind, gentle, and always ready with a smile. He had lived there for over 30 years, raising his kids, planting trees, and watching the community grow. People would stop to chat with him when they saw him out walking, asking about his garden or sharing stories about their own lives. But tonight, something felt different. Maybe it was just the stillness of the evening, or maybe it was something deeper, something he couldn't quite put into words. Either way, he didn't think much of it at the time. He just kept walking, leaning slightly on his cane, taking slow, steady steps. As he passed by the corner store, he paused for a moment to adjust his shoelace. It was an ordinary action, something anyone might do without thinking twice. But what happened next changed everything. Out of nowhere, 2 police officers appeared, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. They approached him quickly, their voices sharp and demanding. "Sir, we need you to stop right there," one of them said, his tone leaving no room for argument. The elderly man looked up, startled but calm. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice steady despite the sudden intrusion. He tried to explain, himself telling them he was just out for a walk, minding his own business. But the officers weren't listening. They claimed they were responding to reports of suspicious activity involving someone matching his description. Suspicious activity? The thought baffled him. He was just an old man out for some fresh air, wearing plain clothes and carrying nothing more than his cane. What could possibly be suspicious about that? Before he could say anything else, the situation escalated faster than he could process. One officer grabbed his arm roughly, yanking him off balance. His cane slipped from his hand, clattering to the ground. "Don't resist," the other officer barked, even though the man hadn't resisted at all. Panic set in as he tried to steady himself, but it was no use. The officers seemed determined to make an example of him, treating him like a criminal instead of a respected member of the community. Then came the blow, a baton striking his side hard enough to knock the wind out of him. Pain shot through his body and he stumbled, falling to the ground. Once he was down, the beating continued. The officers hit him again and again, ignoring his cries of pain and pleas for mercy. Witnesses gathered nearby, horrified by what they were seeing. Some recorded videos on their phones, capturing every brutal moment. Others shouted, begging the officers to stop, but their voices went unheard. When it was finally over, the man lay motionless on the cold pavement, blood seeping through his shirt, his face swollen and bruised. And then, just like that, the officers walked away, leaving him there as if he were nothing more than trash on the street. No attempt to help him, no apology, no acknowledgement of what they had done. They simply left him broken and bleeding, surrounded by strangers who now found themselves caught in the middle of a nightmare. The crowd that had formed began to murmur among themselves, anger and disbelief rippling through the group. Someone called 911, not for the officers, but to get medical help for the injured man. Another person ran to his side, trying to comfort him while keeping pressure on his wounds. "You're going to be okay," they whispered, though whether they were trying to reassure him or themselves was unclear. In that moment, the world felt heavy, weighed down by the injustice of it all. How could this happen? Why would anyone treat another human being this way, especially someone so vulnerable? These questions lingered in the air, unanswered as the ambulance sirens grew louder in the distance. Little did anyone know, this was only the beginning of a story that would soon capture the attention of an entire nation. Because somewhere across town, someone close to the elderly man was about to receive a call that would change everything. For him, for his father, and for countless others whose lives had been touched by similar tragedies. Across town, in a modest apartment filled with books and framed photos, the son of the elderly man sat at his desk. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of his laptop fan spinning as he reviewed some documents. He had spent years serving his country, putting himself in harm's way to protect others. Now retired from active duty, he worked as a private security consultant, using the skills he'd honed over decades to help people navigate dangerous situations. But tonight, his mind wasn't on work. It was on family. His phone buzzed loudly, on the table breaking the silence. At first, he ignored it, thinking it could wait, but when it buzzed again and then a third time, he picked it up, frowning at the screen. It was late for calls and he didn't recognize the number. Still, something told him to answer. "Hello?" he said, his voice deep but calm. On the other end of the line, a neighbor spoke quickly, their words tumbling out in a rush. "You need to come now," they said, their tone urgent. "It's your dad. Something happened with the police." The sentence hit him like a punch to the gut. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. His father? What could have possibly happened? The image of his dad flashed in his mind, the same man who had taught him how to ride a bike, who had patiently explained the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. This was a man who had lived through tough times, who had seen the world change around him, yet always managed to keep his dignity intact. How could anyone hurt someone like that? Without wasting another second, he grabbed his car keys and bolted out the door. As he sped through the streets, memories flooded back, little moments that shaped his relationship with his father. He remembered sitting on the porch as a kid, listening to stories about growing up during the civil rights movement. His dad never spoke with bitterness, even when recounting the struggles he faced. Instead, he talked about resilience, about finding strength in adversity. Those lessons stuck with him, shaping not just his career but also the kind of person he wanted to be. But now, all those lessons felt heavy. What good were they if he couldn't protect the man who had taught them to him? The thought gnawed at him as he drove faster, weaving through traffic. Every red light felt like an eternity. Every slow-moving car ahead of him a personal affront. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white, as anger and fear battled inside him. Who would do this to his father? And why? When he finally arrived at the scene, the sight stopped him cold. There on the sidewalk lay his father, his strong, proud father, crumpled and broken. Blood stained his shirt, and bruises were already forming on his face. Paramedics hovered over him, working quickly to stabilize him, but the damage was impossible to miss. A knot formed in the son's throat as he took it all in. This wasn't just any victim lying there. This was his dad, the man who had raised him, supported him, and loved him unconditionally. Around them, a crowd had gathered, murmuring among themselves. Some held phones, capturing videos of the scene. Others stood silently, shaking their heads in disbelief. But what caught his attention most were the two police officers standing nearby. They weren't helping. They weren't even looking at the injured man. Instead, they chatted casually as though nothing unusual had happened. Their body language screamed indifference, as if beating an elderly man and leaving him on the street was just another day on the job. That's when the rage bubbled to the surface. The son clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay composed. Years of training kicked in. He knew better than to let emotions take over. Slowly, deliberately, he walked toward the officers. "What did you do to my father?" he demanded, his voice low but sharp enough to cut through the noise. The officers turned, startled by his presence. One stepped forward, trying to assert authority. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to step back," he said, pointing a finger. But the son didn't move. He locked eyes with the officer, his gaze unwavering. Standing tall, his broad shoulders squared, he radiated a quiet confidence. That made the officer hesitate. You didn't need to know his background to sense that this wasn't someone you wanted to mess with. "You don't want to test me right now," the son said, his voice steady but laced with warning. Tension crackled in the air like static electricity. People around them began filming, capturing every word, every movement. For the first time, the officers looked uneasy. Maybe it was the intensity in his eyes, or maybe it was the realization that they were being watched. Not just by bystanders, but by someone who clearly meant business. Whatever it was, they shifted uncomfortably, glancing at each other as if unsure what to do next. Meanwhile, the paramedics loaded his father into the ambulance. The son followed closely, refusing to leave his side. As they prepared to leave, he exchanged a few quick words with one of the medics, ensuring his father would receive the best care possible. Then, turning back to the scene, he made a decision. This wasn't going to end here, not tonight, not ever. With his father safely on the way to the hospital, the son got to work. He started by talking to witnesses, asking them to share what they saw. Some recounted how the officers had targeted his father without provocation, while others described the brutal beating in chilling detail. Many handed over videos they had recorded, hoping it would help bring justice. Each story added another layer to the horrifying picture, fueling his determination to make things right. As the night wore on, the son stayed focused, gathering evidence and piecing together what had happened. He knew this wasn't just about his father. It was about everyone who had been treated unfairly, everyone whose voices had been silenced, and he wasn't going to stop until the truth came out. The son stood there, his chest rising and falling with controlled anger as he locked eyes with the two officers. The crowd around him was growing restless, murmurs turning into shouts of outrage. People were filming on their phones, capturing every moment of the confrontation. Some shouted questions at the officers, demanding answers. Others simply stared in disbelief, unable to comprehend how such a thing could happen right in front of them. "You don't want to test me right now," the son repeated, his voice low but firm. He wasn't yelling, but there was something about the way he carried himself that made everyone pay attention. His military background showed in the way he held his ground, calm, steady, and unshakable. Years of training had taught him how to read people, how to assert authority without raising his voice, and right now, he was using every ounce of that experience. One of the officers took a step forward, trying to regain control of the situation. "Sir, I need you to step back. This is an active investigation," he said, his tone clipped and official. But the son didn't budge. Instead, he leaned in slightly, his piercing gaze never leaving the officer's face. "This isn't an investigation," he shot back, his words cutting through the tension like a knife. "This is a crime scene. My father is lying there because of what you did. Don't try to spin this." For a split second, the officer looked unsure, glancing at his partner for support. But the other officer just stood there, arms crossed, avoiding eye contact. They both knew they were in trouble, even if they weren't ready to admit it yet. The cameras rolling around them only added to the pressure. Every word, every movement was being recorded, and they couldn't escape that reality. The son turned to the crowd, addressing them directly. "I need your help," he said, his voice softer now, more approachable. "If anyone saw what happened here tonight, please speak up. If you have video footage, share it with me. We need to make sure this doesn't get swept under the rug." His words struck a chord. One by one, people began stepping forward, eager to contribute. A young woman handed over her phone, explaining that she had filmed the entire incident from start to finish. An older man recounted how he had seen the officers shove the elderly man to the ground before the beating began. Another neighbor described hearing screams and rushing outside to find the victim already unconscious on the pavement. Each account painted a clearer picture of what had transpired, and each story fueled the son's resolve. As the night wore on, the atmosphere shifted. What had started as chaos slowly transformed into a united effort. Strangers who had never met before were now working together, pooling their resources to ensure justice would be served. The son moved among them, thanking each person individually, making sure they felt heard and valued. It wasn't just about gathering evidence, it was about building trust, showing these people that someone was willing to fight for them. But the son knew this was only the beginning. Evidence alone wouldn't be enough. He needed to act quickly, strategically, to keep the momentum going. So, While the paramedics worked to stabilize his father and prepare him for transport, the son made a call. On the other end of the line was a journalist, a trusted friend who had covered stories involving police misconduct before. In hushed tones, he explained the situation, sending over witness statements and video clips as they came in. By morning, the story would break online, shining a spotlight on the injustice that had occurred. Back at the scene, the officers finally realized they were losing control of the narrative. One of them tried to intervene, stepping between the son and a group of witnesses. "You can't interfere with our work," he snapped, pointing a finger. But the son didn't back down. Instead, he raised an eyebrow, challenging the officer, with a look that said everything without uttering a single word. "Interfere?" he replied, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You mean like how you interfered with my father's life? Like how you left him bleeding on the street?" The crowd erupted in cheers, clapping and shouting their support. For the first time, the officers looked genuinely rattled. They glanced at each other nervously, unsure of what to do next. Their usual tactics, intimidation, deflection, dismissal, weren't working here. Not tonight. Not with this man standing in front of them, surrounded by a sea of witnesses who refused to stay silent. Eventually, the ambulance pulled away, its sirens wailing as it sped toward the hospital. The son watched it go, his heart heavy with worry, but his mind focused on the task ahead. He knew his father was in good hands, for now, but the real battle was just beginning. Justice wouldn't come easily, especially when it involved holding law enforcement accountable, but he was ready, more than ready. Before leaving the scene, he took one last look at the officers. "This isn't over," he said, his voice calm but laced with steel. "Not by a long shot." Then, ignoring their protests, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. As he drove to the hospital, the son replayed the events of the night in his mind. He thought about his father, lying helpless on the ground, and the officers who had shown no mercy. He thought about the witnesses who had stepped up, risking their own safety to document the truth. And he thought about the countless others who had suffered similar fates, their stories buried or ignored. By the time he reached the hospital, his emotions were running high, but he forced himself to stay composed. His father needed him to be strong, to be the rock that held everything together. Walking into the emergency room, he spotted the doctor who had been treating his dad. She greeted him with a somber expression, updating him on his father's condition. The injuries were severe, broken ribs, internal bruising, and significant blood loss, but he was stable. That was something, at least. Sitting in the waiting room, the son allowed himself a moment to breathe. He closed his eyes, leaning back against the cold plastic chair. Exhaustion crept in, but he pushed it aside. There was too much to do. Too many pieces to put together. Tomorrow, he would reach out to lawyers, activists, and community leaders. He would organize press conferences, file complaints, and demand answers. But for now, all he could do was sit and wait, hoping against hope that his father would pull through. And in that quiet moment, amidst the sterile walls of the hospital, a plan began to form in his mind. This wasn't just about seeking justice for one man. It was about changing the system that allowed such injustices to happen in the first place. The next morning, the story exploded online. The journalist had done his job well, piecing together the footage and witness accounts into a powerful article that spread like wildfire across social media. By sunrise, hashtags like "Justice for the Elderly Man" and "Accountability Now" were trending nationwide. People from all walks of life, students, parents, activists, even celebrities, shared the story, amplifying calls for justice. What had started as a quiet neighborhood tragedy was now a national conversation. The son sat in the hospital waiting room, scrolling through his phone as notifications poured in. He felt a mix of emotions: anger at the injustice, gratitude for the support, but also an overwhelming sense of responsibility. This wasn't just about his father anymore. It was about every person who had ever been treated unfairly by those sworn to protect them. The weight of it pressed down on him, but he refused to let it break him. Instead, he channeled it into action. He began reaching out to people he trusted, lawyers, civil rights advocates, veterans groups. One call led to another, and soon he had assembled a team of experts ready to help. Each person brought something unique to the table: legal expertise, media connections, grassroots organizing skills. Together, they formed a coalition dedicated to holding the officers accountable and pushing for broader reforms within law enforcement. But the Sun knew that accountability wouldn't come easily. The system was designed to protect itself, and the officers involved weren't going down without a fight. Initial attempts to file charges against them hit roadblocks almost immediately. Legal loopholes, vague policies, and claims of justified use of force became barriers that seemed insurmountable. Yet the Sun remained undeterred. He had faced tougher challenges before, both in combat and in life, and this was no different. If anything, it only fueled his determination. One of the first things he did was organize a meeting with local community leaders. They gathered in a small church hall, filling the space with voices full of passion and purpose. The Sun stood at the front, addressing the group with raw honesty. "We've all seen what happens when we stay silent," he said, his voice steady, but filled with emotion. "This isn't just about my father. It's about every single one of us who has ever been treated like we don't matter. We have the power to change that, but we can't do it alone. We need to stand together." His words resonated deeply, sparking a wave of motivation among those present. Plans were made to hold protests outside the police department, demanding transparency and reform. Flyers were printed, social media campaigns launched, and petitions circulated. Within days, hundreds of people turned out for the first demonstration, holding signs and chanting slogans like, "No justice, no peace," and "Enough is enough." Meanwhile, the Sun continued working behind the scenes, gathering more evidence to strengthen their case. He spent hours reviewing the videos recorded by witnesses, analyzing every frame to ensure nothing was missed. He cross-referenced these with official police reports, looking for inconsistencies and discrepancies. When he found gaps or contradictions, he flagged them, sharing his findings with lawyers who could build a stronger argument. He also reached out to national organizations focused on police accountability, asking for guidance and resources. These groups connected him with survivors of police brutality, many of whom shared their own harrowing stories. Listening to them reinforced why this fight mattered so much, not just for his father, but for everyone who had suffered in silence. Their courage inspired him to keep going, even when the odds felt impossible. As momentum grew, the Sun decided to take the fight directly to policymakers. He attended city council meetings, speaking passionately about the need for change. One meeting, he held up a photo of his father lying injured on the street, his face bruised and swollen. "This is what happens when we fail to hold bad actors accountable," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "This is what happens when we allow fear and prejudice to dictate our actions. My father didn't deserve this. No one does." His testimony struck a chord, drawing attention not only to his father's case but also to systemic issues within law enforcement. Council members promised to review existing policies and consider new measures to increase transparency and accountability. While promises were a start, the Sun knew real change would require sustained pressure, so he kept showing up, attending hearings, writing op-eds, and testifying wherever he could. Back at the hospital, his father's condition slowly improved. The doctors said it would take time for him to fully recover, both physically and emotionally. But despite everything, the elderly man remained resilient. He often asked about the protests and rallies, wanting to know how people were responding to what had happened. The Sun reassured him, telling him about the outpouring of support and solidarity. "You're inspiring people, Dad," he said one evening, sitting by his bedside. "They see your strength, and it gives them hope." The father smiled weakly, though there was pride in his eyes. "I'm proud of you too," he replied softly. "You're doing what needs to be done." Their bond grew stronger during those weeks, forged in pain, but strengthened by purpose. The Sun visited every day, updating his father on the progress they were making. They talked about the future, not just for themselves but for others who might find themselves in similar situations. Both knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, but neither was willing to give up. In the meantime, public pressure mounted. News outlets picked up the story, airing interviews with witnesses and broadcasting clips of the beating. Social media played a crucial role, keeping the issue alive in people's minds. Celebrities used their platforms to amplify the message, urging fans to sign petitions and contact their representatives. Even politicians weighed in, calling for investigations and reforms. Amidst all the chaos, the Sun stayed grounded, focusing on the bigger picture. He understood that true justice went beyond punishing the officers involved. It meant creating a world where such incidents couldn't happen in the first place. To achieve that, he needed to tackle the root causes: racial profiling, lack of accountability, and systemic biases embedded in law enforcement culture. By the time the trial finally began months later, the case had become a symbol of resistance against police misconduct. Thanks to overwhelming evidence and relentless advocacy, both officers were convicted of excessive force and sentenced to prison. While some viewed the verdict as a victory, the Sun knew it was only one step toward broader reform. Still, it was a step worth celebrating. On the day the verdict was announced, crowds gathered outside the courthouse cheering and clapping. Many hugged each other, tears streaming down their faces. For the first time in a long while, there was a glimmer of hope, a reminder that change was possible if people came together and refused to back down. As the Sun stood among the crowd, watching strangers celebrate alongside him, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. This journey had been grueling, but it had also shown him the best of humanity: the kindness of strangers, the power of unity, and the resilience of the human spirit. And while the fight wasn't over, he knew they had taken a significant step forward. With his father recovering and the nation watching, the Sun vowed to keep pushing for change. Because justice, he realized, wasn't just about punishing wrongdoing. It was about building a better future for everyone. The trial was over and the verdict had been delivered. Both officers were found guilty of excessive force and sentenced to prison. For many, this felt like a rare win, a moment where justice prevailed against all odds. But the Sun knew better than to celebrate too soon. Convicting the officers was just one piece of the puzzle. The real challenge lay ahead: fixing the broken system that allowed such abuses to happen in the first place. In the weeks following the trial, the Sun threw himself into advocacy work. He didn't want this case to fade into obscurity once the headlines disappeared. Too often, stories like his father's sparked outrage for a brief moment, only to be forgotten as new scandals took center stage. He was determined not to let that happen here. If anything, he wanted to use this momentum to drive lasting change. He started by organizing town hall meetings, inviting community members, activists, and even some sympathetic lawmakers to discuss what needed to happen next. These gatherings weren't just about venting frustrations, they were about finding solutions. At one meeting, an older woman stood up, her hands trembling slightly as she held the microphone. "I've lived in this city my whole life," she said, her voice cracking with emotion, "and I've seen things like this happen before. But no one ever listens to us. No one ever cares until it's too late." Her words struck a nerve, echoing the feelings of so many others in the room. The Sun nodded, acknowledging her pain. "You're right," he responded. "For too long, people have turned a blind eye to these issues, but we can't afford to stay silent anymore. We have to demand better, not just for ourselves, but for our children and grandchildren." The meetings became a space for healing, as much as action. People shared their own experiences with police misconduct, each story adding another layer to the broader narrative. Some recounted being stopped and searched without cause. Others talked about loved ones who had died under suspicious circumstances, their cases never properly investigated. Each account reinforced the urgency of the fight they were waging. With input from these discussions, the Sun worked with lawyers and policy experts to draft proposals aimed at reforming law enforcement practices. They focused on key areas: increasing accountability through independent oversight boards, mandating body cameras for all officers and implementing stricter penalties for misconduct. It wasn't enough to simply punish bad actors after the fact. They needed systems in place to prevent abuse from happening in the first place. But changing policies required more than just good ideas. It required political will. So the Sun took his campaign to Capitol Hill, testifying before Congress about the need for nationwide reforms. Standing at the podium, he spoke not just as the son of a victim, but as a representative of countless families who had suffered similar losses. "My father is alive today because of luck and resilience," he said, his voice steady but filled with conviction. But luck shouldn't be the deciding factor between life and death. Every person deserves to feel safe in their community, regardless of the color of their skin or how much money they make. His testimony resonated deeply, drawing bipartisan support for several reform bills. Lawmakers praised his courage and commitment, vowing to prioritize these issues moving forward. While progress was slow, politics always seemed to move at a glacial pace. The Sun remained patient, knowing that meaningful change rarely happened overnight. Back home, he continued working with grassroots organizations to keep the pressure on. Protests evolved into workshops teaching people how to document incidents of police misconduct and file formal complaints. Community patrols were organized, encouraging neighbors to look out for one another while documenting interactions with law enforcement. These efforts weren't glamorous, but they were effective, empowering ordinary citizens to take an active role in shaping their communities. Meanwhile, his father's recovery progressed steadily. Though physically weaker than before, the elderly man refused to let bitterness consume him. Instead, he embraced his newfound role as a symbol of resilience. When invited to speak at events, he accepted graciously, sharing messages of hope and forgiveness. "What happened to me was wrong," he would say, addressing crowds with quiet dignity. "But holding on to anger won't fix anything. What matters is what we do next." Father and son often reflected on how far they'd come since that fateful night. Sitting together on the porch, they talked about the future, not just for themselves, but for others who might face similar struggles. "We've got a lot of work left to do," the son admitted one evening, leaning back in his chair. "But I think we're making a difference." His father nodded, a faint smile playing on his lips. "You've always been strong," he replied. "Stronger than me, maybe. Just don't forget why you're doing this. It's not just about us, it's about everyone." Those words stayed with the son, grounding him whenever doubt crept in. There were days when the weight of it all felt unbearable, when setbacks threatened to derail everything they'd worked for. But then he'd remember his father's resilience, the courage of the witnesses who had spoken up, and the countless strangers who had rallied behind them. That reminder kept him going, pushing him to keep fighting even when the odds seemed impossible. As months turned into years, their efforts began to bear fruit. Cities across the country adopted versions of the reforms they had championed, creating more transparent and accountable police departments. Independent oversight boards were established, giving communities a voice in how law enforcement operated. Training programs were revamped, emphasizing de-escalation techniques and cultural sensitivity. Slowly but surely, the tide was turning. The Sun also founded a nonprofit organization dedicated to combating police misconduct and supporting victims of brutality. Named in honor of his father, the initiative provided resources like legal aid, counseling services, and educational workshops. It became a lifeline for families navigating the aftermath of traumatic encounters with law enforcement, offering not just practical help, but also a sense of solidarity. Through it all, the bond between father and son grew stronger. They attended rallies together, gave joint interviews, and supported each other through the highs and lows of their journey. Their story served as a testament to the power of unity, proving that even in the face of overwhelming adversity, people could come together to create change. Looking back, the son realized how much he had learned, not just about the legal system or activism, but about humanity itself. He saw the best and worst of people during those years, witnessing acts of cruelty and kindness in equal measure. And while the scars of the past would always remain, they no longer defined him. Instead, they fueled his determination to build, a better future, a future where no one else would have to endure what his father had gone through. Because ultimately, this wasn't just about seeking justice for one man. It was about ensuring that every person, regardless of background or circumstance, could live with dignity and respect. And though the road ahead would undoubtedly have its challenges, the son walked it with unwavering faith, guided by the lessons his father had taught him all those years ago. Years had passed since that fateful night, but the memory of it still lingered, not as a source of pain but as a reminder of how far they'd come. The son stood on stage at a community center, addressing a packed auditorium filled with people from all walks of life. Some were survivors of police brutality, others activists, and many were simply ordinary citizens who wanted to see change. The room buzzed with energy, a mix of hope and determination in the air. He began his speech by recounting the story everyone knew so well: the elderly man beaten on the street, left broken and bleeding, while two officers walked away without a second thought. He didn't shy away from the details, describing the fear and anger he felt that night when he received the call about his father. "I'll never forget the way my heart sank," he said, pausing for a moment to collect himself. "But what I remember most isn't the pain, it's what happened next. What happened next was a movement sparked not just by outrage but by unity. Strangers came together, sharing their stories, their resources, and their voices. Lawyers volunteered their time, journalists risked their careers to expose the truth, and everyday people marched in the streets demanding accountability. It wasn't easy. There were setbacks, moments of doubt, and times when it felt like the system would never budge. But through sheer persistence, they pushed forward, one step at a time." The son turned to his father, sitting in the front row, and smiled warmly. "This man right here, he taught me everything I know about resilience," he said, pointing to him. "Even after everything he went through, he refused to let bitterness take over. Instead, he chose forgiveness. He chose hope. And because of that, we were able to turn tragedy into something meaningful." The crowd erupted in applause, some standing to cheer. The elderly man waved modestly, clearly uncomfortable with being the center of attention. But deep down, he knew his role in this fight hadn't been small. His willingness to share his story, to stand tall despite his scars, had inspired countless others to do the same. Together, they had built a foundation for change, a foundation that continued to grow stronger each day. The nonprofit organization founded in his honor had become a beacon of hope for marginalized communities. It provided free legal aid to families fighting for justice, offered counseling services to help survivors heal emotionally, and conducted workshops to educate people about their rights. One of its most impactful programs trained citizen watchdogs, volunteers, who documented interactions between law enforcement and civilians, ensuring transparency and accountability at the local level. These efforts weren't flashy or glamorous, but they worked. Slowly but surely, trust began to rebuild between communities and police departments willing to reform. As the son spoke, he highlighted victories both big and small. In one city, an independent oversight board successfully investigated allegations of misconduct, leading to disciplinary action against several officers. In another town, mandatory de-escalation training reduced incidents of excessive force by nearly 40%. Even national legislation once thought impossible had begun to gain traction thanks to relentless advocacy. None of these changes happened overnight, but they proved that progress was possible if people stayed committed. Still, the son acknowledged that there was much work left to do. "We've made strides," he admitted, pacing across the stage. "But let's not kid ourselves. This fight is far from over. There are still places where injustice runs rampant, where people feel unsafe in their own neighborhoods. We can't rest until every single person feels protected, not threatened, by those sworn to serve them." His words struck a chord, prompting nods and murmurs of agreement throughout the audience. He urged everyone to keep pushing, to stay involved, even when the cameras stopped rolling and the headlines faded. "Real change doesn't happen in a courtroom or a protest march alone," he said. "It happens in our schools, our workplaces, our homes. It happens when we teach our kids to value empathy over judgment, compassion over cruelty. It happens when we hold ourselves accountable, too. By the end of his speech, the atmosphere in the room had shifted. People weren't just leaving informed, they were leaving inspired. They hugged each other, exchanged contact information, and promised to stay connected. For the first time in a long while, there was a sense of optimism in the air. Not the naive kind that ignored reality, but the grounded, resilient kind that understood the road ahead would be tough and was ready to face it anyway. Afterward, the son joined his father outside, where reporters waited eagerly for interviews. Cameras flashed, microphones jutted toward them, and questions flew fast. But instead of focusing solely on the past, the son steered the conversation toward the future. "My dad's story isn't unique," he told the reporters. "There are thousands like him, maybe millions. What makes this different is that we decided to act. And if more people start acting, if more people refuse to stay silent, we can create a world where no one has to suffer like this again." Later, that evening, father and son sat together on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink. It was quiet now, peaceful, a stark contrast to the chaos of recent years. Yet neither of them took the moment for granted. They had fought hard to reach this point, and they knew better than anyone how fragile peace could be. "You've done good," the father said softly, breaking the silence. "Better than I ever could have imagined," the son chuckled, shaking his head. "I couldn't have done any of it without you," he replied. "You're the reason I kept going. Your strength, it carried me through." For a while, they sat in comfortable silence, reflecting on their journey. The scars of the past would always remain, physical and emotional, but they no longer defined them. Instead, they served as reminders of what they had overcome, of the lives they had touched, and of the legacy they hoped to leave behind. As darkness fell, the son leaned back in his chair, gazing up at the stars. "Do you think we'll ever get it right?" he asked, his tone thoughtful. "Not perfect, but close enough?" His father smiled faintly, his eyes twinkling in the dim light. "Maybe not in my lifetime," he said. "But if we keep trying, if we keep teaching people to care, that's enough. That's how you change the world." And with that, the son felt a renewed sense of purpose. The fight wasn't over, and maybe it never truly would be. But as long as there were people willing to stand up, speak out, and demand better, there was hope. Hope for justice, for equality, for a brighter tomorrow. And that, he realized, was worth every struggle, every sacrifice, every sleepless night. Together they sat under the vast night sky, dreaming of a future where stories like theirs wouldn't need to exist. Until then, they vowed to keep fighting. For themselves, for each other, and for all those who deserved a fair shot at life.